Welcome to Worlds Apart. After years of being unable to strike a peace deal with the Palestinians, Israel now wants to have a say in the resolution of another conflict, this time in Syria. Its objective is clear: to minimize the regional influence of Iran, but isn't it a little bit too late in the game? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Tzipi Livni, a prominent Israeli politician and former foreign minister of Israel. Ms. Livni, it's great to see you. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Now, you're currently in the opposition to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, but as far as I understand, when it comes to the issue of Iran, most Israeli politicians agree that it represents a major deadly threat to Israel that has to be curtailed through all possible means. Am I right in formulating your position?
Yes, and not only for Israeli politicians. We believe that Iran is a problem to Israel, but not only to Israel, but to the entire region. And therefore, it needs to be dealt with the entire international community as such.
I assume Prime Minister Netanyahu, who recently visited Russia, communicated something along those same lines to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Do you by any chance know how the Russians have responded to those concerns raised by the Israeli Prime Minister?
I hope that also Russia would understand that Israel's concern are part of the concerns of other states in the region, and not only. Listen, Iran is part of the problem. Iran would not accept the right of Israel to exist. Iran supports Hezbollah, which is a terrorist organization in Lebanon. Iran supports terror in the region and finances terror in the region. And therefore, we all understand that there's a need to give an answer, of course, and to confront Daesh, ISIS, with all they are doing in the region, but we also need to confront, to minimize, and to reduce the power of Iran. And we are looking at the day after. I mean, we are all familiar of the situation in Syria right now. And the real question is what the day after would look like. If we would see Iran and then Iran influence in Iraq and Iran influence in Syria and Iran influence in Lebanon with Hezbollah, this would be a huge problem. And we believe, as I said before, that this is something that needs to be dealt by the entire international community.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because the view in Moscow, and let me know if you disagree with that, is that the Iranian influence is indeed growing. There is no dispute about that, but Moscow believes that partially it is growing because of Israel's own policies or the policies of Israel's closest allies. It all started with the invasion of Iraq, which allowed Iran to gain a foothold there. That was a campaign in the Israeli campaign in Lebanon, which consecutively led to Hezbollah gaining more influence in that country. Then was Syria. Now there is Yemen. Don't you think that at least in part, Iranians' influence that you are so concerned about is growing because of the opportunities that were handed to it by Israel or Israel's allies?
No way. I mean, to accuse Israel for Iran being a state that would not accept the right of Israel to exist, that supports terror, the way they are acting in Yemen or Syria, how this is connected to Israel. And listen, it is more important to discuss the situation now and what needs to be done. And as I said before, let's take Hezbollah as an example. It's a terrorist organization, designated terrorist organization. We don't, when we are talking about Lebanon as a state, what kind of state as an armed militia which is being influenced and in a way the proxy of another state in the region? And therefore, I would not take any of your assumption about Israel's influence or responsibility for Iran, but I think that it is more important now anyway to deal with the situation. So I would not say that this is an easy situation now, and I would say that it is complicated. But this is the role and responsibility of the international community, including Russia, to give an answer to this. And when we look at the region, there are two different, in a way, camps. One is the camp of these extremists, those that are supporting terror. And for me, it is less important whether it is Shia terror or Sunni terror, whether it's Hezbollah or Daesh. Both of them should be not acceptable.
Well, you mentioned that we need to deal with the situation as it is on the ground, and Russia's ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, just recently said that in Moscow's view, Iran is playing, quote unquote, a very constructive role in Syria. So obviously there is some appreciation of what Iran is doing on the ground. Given that Russia appreciates Iran's role there, do you think there's still a room for Moscow to accommodate Israel's concerns? And to what extent do you believe Israel's concerns have to be accommodated?
I think that both states, both countries should put on the table the mutual interest. And it's not only accommodate Israel's interest or concerns. Let's speak about the day after. Let's speak about what is the best way, or what is best for all of us in the day after, hopefully, the situation in Syria would change. Do we want Iran as a state that supports terror as a superpower in the region? And as I said before, this is not only the concern of Israel. In the past, when we initiated Resolution 1701 against Hezbollah, Russia was part of it, in an understanding that this is a terrorist organization. So even though now Iran is being a part of those that are fighting others in Syria and in the region, let's speak now about the day after. Let's speak now about the situation the day after, and let's try to minimize their influence in the future, because it's going to be problematic not only for Israel, I can assure you.
Absolutely, and I think there is also a keen understanding that in a medium term, Iran also represents a political and economic competitor for Russia in the region. But again, there is also a realization that without Iran, you cannot stabilize Syria, or perhaps the region more generally. If you had your way, if Israel had its way, what exactly would you do? I mean, is there anything short of wiping Iran off the map that would completely allay Israelis' concerns? What could give you that peace of mind?
Well, you know, it's a tough region. To speak about peace of mind in the region is something which is more than optimism. But I would speak about minimizing damages or meeting the challenges. And therefore, as I said before, let's look at the region from in a kind of satellite perspective. And Iran, in the past, the world dealt with Iran on their nuclear program, and they reached an agreement. Now, firstly, we need to see that this agreement is being implemented as it should. Secondly, as long as Iran supports terror, the entire international community should say to Iran, this is not acceptable. You should stop financing terror. From our perspective, it's Hezbollah, it's Hamas. For others, is what they do in other places. But this is something that I believe Israel should sit together with Russia, of course with the United States, with other states, and to say, okay, it's not just, you know, a small Israeli problem. Let's look at the region. You know, in the past, I think that there are those thinking that the problems in the region are the problems of Israel. But I think that there is a better understanding now in the entire world that what's happening here can influence and affect other parts of the world.
Let me ask you specifically about Syria, because you keep talking about Iran supposedly supporting terrorist organizations, because throughout the Syrian conflict, Israel proclaimed its neutrality, but I think it's not a secret internationally that your diplomatic ties with geopolitical sponsors of the so-called Syrian opposition were becoming increasingly more accommodating. And by that I mean, first and foremost, Saudi Arabia, which also, we all know, supports terrorist organizations. Wouldn't it be fair to say that in Syria, Israel found itself on the losing side, and now you are trying to get your way through diplomatic means, which is fair, but that doesn't mean that you should get all that you are asking for.
No, not at all. I would not accept it. Israel, since day one, decided not to involve in the situation in Syria. We are just trying to help those wounded people that are trying to come here.
Well, many of them were wounded fighters and wounded jihadists.
We are helping those that need help and they're coming to Israeli border and give them and help them in Israeli hospital. This is humanitarian stuff. But Israel is not involved in the situation in Syria, and rightly so. But we do hope that the end game, or what would happen in the end, would not affect Israel's security. And there is no position in Israel on this. And therefore, since I believe in international diplomacy, I believe that this is something that it is very legitimate from the Israeli side to put our concerns on the table and to have a better understanding that our concerns should be, and are, I believe, the concerns of others in the region as well.
When you mention others in the region, I know that you're very passionate about democracy and its values, but I don't think you would contend that the Gulf states, as well as Turkey, were so keen on overthrowing the Assad regime because of their appreciation for democracy. I think it was pretty clear, and tell me if you disagree with that, that from the very beginning, the support for the Syrian opposition was driven primarily by this animosity against Iran, and that objective wasn't achieved throughout this conflict. Is that not a fair portrayal?
I would like not to refer to the positions of other states in the region and the reason for them to make this position or the other. As I said before, Israel is not involved in the situation in Syria. And I believe in general that when it comes to terror and those extremists in the region, let's not take one terrorist organization as the answer to the other terrorist organization. That's all. And let's see together how we can confront terror coming from all sides, unfortunately.
Well, since you mentioned terror, most recent terrorist attacks in Europe, including Russia, were conducted by Sunni terrorists. The so-called Islamic State is a self-avowed Sunni supremacist who executed Shias, Kurds, Yazidis. I'm sure they would have no problem whatsoever targeting Jews. In practical terms, if you take Iran out of the equation, who can take on that jihadi force? Because I don't think it would be fully fair to refer to Iran, the state of Iran, as a terrorist organization. That's a political interpretation of Israel. But if you take the Iranian Israel out of the equation altogether, who will be there to confront the jihadi force?
All of us need to confront the jihadi, all the terrorist organizations, as I said before. For me, whether it comes from Sunni ideology or Shia ideology, it is less important. And therefore, all of us, the international community, should confront those. And we have states that support terrorist organizations like Iran and Hezbollah is a terrorist organization, and terrorist organizations in themselves. And we need to act against them. And I believe that we need to act against them forcefully. And this is something that the international community should do. And therefore, you would not find me supporting in any way or living with the situation of what Daesh is doing against all of us, because they would not compromise on our existence.
But how then would you explain Israel's position of neutrality in the Syrian conflict? If you're so willing to confront terrorist organizations, why didn't Israel jump on board, joined Russia in Syria, and help exterminate the jihadi force there? Then the Iranian influence perhaps would have been somewhat curtailed.
I hope that you would not suggest that Israel would send our soldiers to fight in Syria as well. It would not happen, hopefully. And I hope that this is not your suggestion.
But how then? I mean, I don't want to be argumentative, but how then? Because there is a practical need for somebody to be there in Syria. Russia doesn't want to send its troops there. Israel doesn't want to send its troops there. The United States doesn't want to do that. That leaves the only option, and the only option is Iran.
Israel is a completely different situation because, unfortunately, there are those that are abusing and exploiting the fact that the public opinion in the Arab world is against Israel, and Israel as being seen as the enemy, that if Israel takes one of the a position that can be exploited by the enemies to say that it's not about Syria, but this is part of the entire Israeli Arab or Jewish-Muslim conflict. This is something would deteriorate the situation, and this is part of our responsibility. But I believe that there is enough power in the world and the responsibility of the international community to confront terror, wherever and whatever is the kind of terror, as I said before, whether it is Sunni or Shia. And since you refer to the Sunni terrorist organization, we have, unfortunately, on the Palestinian side, Hamas, that represent the religious side of the conflict. They represent also, in a way, this Sunni ideology that would never accept our right to live in peace in the region. They are using terror as well, and this is something also that needs to be dealt by the international community. And of course, Israel is acting against it when we should.
Well, Ms. Livni, let's discuss your ideas on the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in just a few moments. We have to take a very short break, but we will be back very soon. Stay tuned.
They're the war hawks selling you on the idea that dropping bombs brings peace, to the chicken hawks forcing you to fight in the battles that they start.
The news hawks try to tell you that celebrity gossip and tabloid murder trials are the most important news of the day.
While the hawks of advertising tell you that you are not cool enough unless you buy their product.
Watching the hawks, watching the hawks.
These are the hawks that we, along with our audience, will be watching.
What politicians do is something we don't do. They put themselves on the line, and they get accepted or rejected. So when you want to be president, why would you want to be? Why would someone want to be president? What's it like to be president? What's it like when the phone rings at 3 in the morning? Can't be a good call. I'm interested always in the whys and the hows. And Q Larry. Question more.
18 years ago, I traveled across the United States, exploring America's deadly love affair with the gun.
If a bad guy tried to get to one of my family members, he would have better luck with a butter knife against a grizzly bear than hurting one of my babies.
Since my book was published in the year 2000, more than 500,000 Americans have been killed by firearms in the USA.
We had a SWAT team, yes we did. Yes, this was in middle school. We go through drills, and we put ourselves in real scenarios. It was interesting to see who actually got hit by the paintball gun.
I decided to return to the subject, to track down each gun owner who I'd met and photographed those years ago.
I don't know the answer, but we are not the problem.
Welcome back to Worlds Apart with Tzipi Livni, a prominent Israeli politician and former foreign minister of Israel. Ms. Livni, you've already alluded to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I know you've been a loyal proponent of the two-state solution. You claim that's what the majority of the Israeli public wants. If that's the case, why do people keep voting Mr. Netanyahu and his party into power?
Well, very good question. Yes, according to the polls, not only my, hopeful thoughts, there is a majority in Israel supporting the idea of two states for two peoples and peace. But yet there is no belief that there is a partner on the other side, that there is no hope for peace. Unfortunately, part of my responsibility here as a leader is to try and convince the Israelis not to give up. And I might say I was a little bit optimistic until a few months ago when I thought that maybe Trump would really make the deal which is essential for the future of the State of Israel. I hope that he would do so, but it looks, I'm less optimistic these days.
Well, before I ask you about why you're less optimistic, let me ask you one more question about the two-state solution, because as I understand your argument, you believe that two states is the only option if Israel wants to remain democratic. But it is my perception that in many advanced democracies, democratic practices, democratic institutions, even democratic notions, democratic ideas are being put to the test. What used to be considered marginal or even extremist ideas are now gaining prominence and becoming more and more mainstream. Do you think the notion of democracy, as you understand it, will stand the test of both time and the test of regional turbulence? Because regional turbulence obviously propels many of those extremist and radical ideas to the center.
I agree that we see all over the world more and more populism. We see fear taking place instead of hope. And this is something that need to address. But you spoke just about democracy. I would like to speak about the state of Israel as a Jewish democratic state. And it's a matter of values. It's not just a matter of system. And therefore, the way to keep the values of Israel as a Jewish democratic state, the meaning is to divide this tiny place into two different states. One is Israel that gives the answer to the national aspiration of the Jewish people, and the other is an answer to the demands of the national movement of the Palestinians. And therefore, going back to the beginning of our discussion, I believe that acting against these extremists, those that represent unsolvable religious conflict by terror, this is something that needs to be handled by all of us by supporting and getting more strength to the more pragmatics, moderates in the region. I mean, nobody is perfect, and I would not suggest that every democracy is, great, or every state is a democracy in the region. But part of our values, also as Jews and as a democratic state, is equal rights. And therefore, we need to separate ourselves from the Palestinians. We have minority of Palestinians living in Israel. There are equal rights citizens. But we need to embrace the idea of two states for two peoples. Each state gives an answer to national aspiration of different peoples. The Palestinian state would be demilitarized. The Palestinians already agreed to this, and this is part of Israel's security demands and also the interest of the world. I mean, nobody wants another terror state in the region or failed state in the region.
Now, going back to your negotiations with the Palestinians, I heard both you and Saeb Erekat, the chief Palestinian negotiator, express a guarded optimism concerning the Trump administration's willingness to restart the talks. That was about 3 months ago. I gather you're not as optimistic as you were, right?
Unfortunately not, because, when we had this meeting, the first meeting between Trump and Netanyahu, between Trump and Abu Mazen, and in his visit to the region, Trump was speaking about the big deal. And there is only one deal that I believe can work and can give an answer to both of us, Israelis and Palestinians, and this is the two states for two peoples as a solution. I know that this is something that is being supported by Russia as well and by the entire international community. So there was a possibility here to have everybody supporting something that represents the interest of Israel, the Palestinians, and the entire international community. What I believe needs to be done is to call both sides for negotiations with the support of the Arab world and the international community, but not just negotiations for the sake of negotiations, but negotiations on the basis of, the idea is to end the conflict on the basis of two states for two peoples, demilitarized state for Palestine, peace for everybody, and this can be the basis just to start from that we would know where are we going and not just, moving around without any sense of direction.
Well, I think the Palestinians would totally agree with you on that. I've interviewed a number of high-ranking Palestinian officials, and this is precisely what we want, and they're feeling that they're not getting it from the Israeli side. But if I may ask you one more question about the Trump administration, because it also expressed its intention to contribute to the resolution of the Korean conflict, so much so that I've now heard a number of experts suggesting that the stalemate that existed, between the two countries for several decades wasn't that bad after all, especially when you consider the increased possibility of another conflict on the Korean Peninsula. Is that a concern in your part of the world that the American mediation at this point of time may make things worse, not better?
Well, we hope that we all hope that North Korea would not, push the world to an unacceptable situation. But I want to say something which is very important, since we discussed the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and we discussed also all the extremism in the region. I'm not talking now about North Korea, but there are those saying that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the reason for extremism in the region, and this is something that I would not accept. You know that I truly want to solve this conflict. I believe that it's an Israeli and Palestinian interest, as well as the international community. But assuming that we would solve this conflict, Iran would not change its ideology, neither Hezbollah nor Hamas, and therefore it needs to be understood that we need to solve this conflict and to act against extremism and terror in the region as well.
So you want to compartmentalize this conflict for everything else that's going on in the region, even though, as you well know, everything is highly interconnected and one conflict influences another conflict in many ways. I want to seize on something that you said just now, and I heard you make that observation before, that the successful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would break the so-called glass ceiling in Israel's relations with other Arab states. I presume, again, you mean mostly Gulf states. How strong of a motivator could that be for Prime Minister Netanyahu, in your view?
This is something, I mean, the Arab Peace Initiative and the Arab League decision said that when Israel reached peace with the Palestinians, and we would achieve peace in the entire region and normalize their relations with Israel. And therefore, it's not only my opinion. This is something which is on the table. They already said that it is negotiable, but need to be negotiated between Israel and the Palestinians, not between Israel and the Arab world. And therefore, I believe that their role is very important for Israel and for the Palestinians. For Israelis, it is very important because, you know, the average Israeli would say, okay, what can we get from the Palestinians? Any peace treaty is taking some risks. We have terror coming from the Palestinian side. We are giving up territory and also taking some security risks. So the answer is that this can change the strategic situation of Israel in the region. And therefore, it's not just about giving something to the Palestinians, but also getting something from the Arabs. This is one thing from the Israeli perspective, and Netanyahu knows it. But from his, I don't know, political reasons or other, we don't see a real move toward this.
Well, it's interesting that you make this argument because Israel has long balked at the Palestinians going to the United Nations and trying to internationalize the issue. But essentially, you're advocating the exact same thing, only with Sunni Arabs, because you can gain your own benefits there. I mean, how is that different from the Palestinians trying to involve the Europeans in the international community to help them resolve their issues with you?
I believe in bilateral negotiations, but I believe that these bilateral negotiations should be supported by the international community, not to replace the decisions that is being needed by both sides by European or other decisions that the parties are not involved in or make their own. What the Palestinians are doing, they are trying to get the support of a Palestinian state, 67 line, Jerusalem its capital. This is part or these all issues that need to be negotiated. This is one thing.
Why do they have to be negotiated again? Hasn't that been already negotiated and sealed?
It was negotiated. We breached some gaps, but not enough. In 2014, President Obama wanted to put a framework for negotiations on the table. Even Netanyahu accepted it with reservation, but Abu Mazen didn't give, Mahmoud Abbas didn't give an answer to this, unfortunately. And therefore, it's not too late to put something on the table and to force both leaders to make a decision. I'm not suggesting to force the final status agreement as such, but put something on the table and say to both sides, you are invited to negotiate on the basis of this, yes or no, and make both sides make their own decision. This is something which is very important, without any reference to all the sensitive issues that are on the table, but to the basics.
Okay. Well, Ms. Livni, we have to leave it there. Unfortunately, the time is up. I really, really appreciate your time here with us. And to our viewers, please share your comments on our Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube pages. And I hope to see you again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.
Bye.